The Lavender Tea Murder.
Chapter 1. The Invitation. The morning in London unfolded with its usual quiet precision inside the apartment of Hercule Poirot. It was a place where order was not merely preferred, it was essential. Every object existed in harmony with its surroundings, every angle deliberate, every detail considered. The curtains were drawn back to exactly the same height on both sides of the window. The silverware on the breakfast table reflected the soft morning light, aligned so precisely that even the slightest disturbance would have been noticeable to the trained eye. A vase of fresh flowers stood at the center of the table, each stem arranged with mathematical care. Poirot himself sat upright in his chair, examining his breakfast with the same seriousness one might reserve for a complex criminal investigation. He adjusted the placement of his cup by a fraction of an inch, then leaned back slightly, satisfied. "Order," he murmured, "is the foundation of all things." It was at that exact moment that the disturbance arrived. A knock at the door. Poirot's eyes lifted, not in annoyance, but in quiet curiosity. Interruptions, he believed, were rarely accidental. They were, more often than not, the beginning of something. A letter was delivered. He accepted it, with a polite nod, closing the door gently behind him before returning to his table. For a brief moment, he simply held the envelope in his hand, weighing it, not just physically, but mentally. It was not an ordinary letter. The paper was cream-colored, of a slightly heavier quality than usual correspondence. The edges were smooth, yet there was something about it that suggested hesitation. Not in its construction, but in its intent. Poirot turned it slowly between his fingers. Then his gaze settled on the handwriting. Delicate, controlled, but not entirely steady. "Ah," he said softly. "There is a mind behind this, one that wishes to appear calm." He placed the envelope neatly on the table, aligning it with the edge before opening it with careful precision. No tear, no unnecessary movement, only a clean, exact incision. Inside was a single card. He lifted it. His eyes moved slowly across the words. "You are invited to my birthday tea at Greystone Cottage, Lavender Lane, Surrey. I wish to settle an important matter before it is too late. Mrs. Penelope Gray." Poirot read the message once, then again, then a third time. He did not rush. He never rushed. Instead, he allowed the words to settle, to reveal themselves, not in what they said, but in what they implied. He placed the card down carefully. "Before it is too late," he repeated quietly. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips, though there was no amusement in it. "Those, my friend, are the most dangerous words in the English language." He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. A birthday tea. An invitation from a woman he did not know. And yet, she knew him. She had written specifically to him, not to the police, not to a friend, but to Hercule Poirot, which meant only one thing. She expected trouble, or worse. She expected something that could not be undone. Poirot rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, London moved as it always did, carriages passing, footsteps echoing along the pavement, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing without interruption. But for Poirot, something had already shifted. There was now a question, and where there was a question, there was a mystery. He returned to the table and picked up the card once more, this time studying the handwriting in greater detail. The slight hesitation in certain strokes, the pressure in others, a controlled hand, yes, but not entirely confident. "Not fear," he murmured. "No, something else. Urgency, but not panic. A person who wished to act before something happened. or before someone stopped them. By midday, Poirot had made his decision. He would go, not because he was invited, but because he was expected. And that, he knew, was far more significant. The journey to Surrey was calm, almost deceptively so. The train moved steadily through the countryside, leaving behind the noise and structure of London for something quieter, softer. Fields stretched endlessly beneath the pale sky. Trees stood in gentle clusters, their leaves barely stirring in the breeze. Villages appeared briefly and then disappeared again, as though they existed only for a moment before returning to silence. Poirot sat by the window, his reflection faintly visible against the passing landscape. "Peace," he said softly, "is often the greatest illusion." When he arrived at Lavender Lane, the first thing he noticed was not the houses. It was the scent. Lavender, rich, heavy, almost overwhelming. Poirot stopped walking. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, allowing the fragrance to settle. And then his expression changed, just slightly. "Too much?" he said. He looked along the lane. Lavender bushes lined the path, their purple blossoms swaying gently in the light wind. It was picturesque, beautiful even. But it was not natural. "Nature," Poirot murmured, "does not insist upon itself so strongly." He continued forward. At the end of the lane stood Greystone Cottage. It was a house that had seen time pass. The stone walls were pale and worn, the edges softened by years of quiet existence. The windows reflected the light, but there was something behind them, a stillness that did not belong entirely to peace. Poirot paused at the gate. For a brief moment, he simply observed. Then, with calm certainty, he adjusted his gloves, straightened his coat, and stepped forward. "A birthday tea," he said quietly. He looked once more at the house. "Yes, I think not." Chapter 2. The Tea Party. Greystone Cottage stood at the far end of Lavender Lane, as though it had deliberately chosen isolation. The narrow path leading to it was bordered on both sides by thick rows of lavender plants, their purple blossoms gently swaying in the afternoon breeze. The scene was picturesque, too picturesque. The fragrance filled the air in soft, rolling waves, pleasant at first, calming even, but the longer one remained within it, the more it began to feel excessive. Hercule Poirot paused for a moment at the entrance to the garden. He inhaled slowly. Then again. His expression did not change, but his mind had already noted it. "Too strong," he murmured quietly. "It insists upon itself." He stepped forward. The tea had already begun. Small round tables were arranged across the garden, each covered with delicate cloths and set with fine china. Cups and saucers gleamed softly under the afternoon light, while plates of neatly prepared sandwiches and pastries sat untouched, as though the guests had forgotten their purpose. It was, on the surface, a perfect English tea, but Poirot was not interested in surfaces. He was interested in people, and people, he knew, rarely hid themselves as well as they believed. His eyes moved calmly from one face to another. Dr. Haydock sat slightly forward in his chair, his posture attentive, his gaze sharp. A man accustomed to observing others, but perhaps not accustomed to being observed himself. Mrs. Harry leaned delicately toward the center of the group, her expression polite yet eager. Her eyes moved frequently, collecting details, storing them. A woman who listened more than she spoke, but remembered everything. Then Miss Lydia Arkwright, introduced as Mrs. Gray's niece. Poirot studied her carefully. She was young, well presented, but there was a tension in her movements, a subtle unease that betrayed itself in the smallest gestures. Her hands rested lightly on her lap. But her fingers shifted slightly as though they could not remain still for long. More importantly, her gaze, It moved again and again toward the house. Not the garden, not the guests, the house. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. Then there was Robert Gray. He sat apart, not physically distant, but emotionally so. His posture was straight, his expression controlled, his face almost devoid of reaction. Too controlled. There was no warmth in him, no visible grief, no anticipation, no engagement. Cold, Poirot thought quietly. Or perhaps disciplined. And finally, Millicent Gray. She sat quietly, her presence almost fading into the background. But Poirot did not overlook her. He never overlooked quiet people. Her face was calm, her posture perfect. But her stillness was unnatural. It was not peace, it was restraint, as though she were holding something back, not words, not actions, but emotion itself. Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Ah, mademoiselle, you are not as invisible as you think." At the center of it all sat Mrs. Penelope Gray, the woman who had written the letter, the woman who had summoned him. She was composed, elegant, every movement deliberate. There was a refinement about her, something cultivated over years of control and discipline. But beneath it, tension. Her hands, though steady, held a slight rigidity. Her shoulders remained straight, but not relaxed, and her eyes sharp, cold, observing, not hosting, waiting. Conversation flowed lightly across the garden. Polite remarks, small laughter, carefully chosen words. But there was no ease, no warmth. It was a gathering of people who were present, but not comfortable. Poirot took his seat quietly. He said very little. He did not need to speak. Observation, for him, was conversation enough. At last, tea was poured. The servant moved gracefully between the tables, placing cups before each guest with quiet efficiency. The delicate clink of porcelain against saucers echoed softly through the garden. Each guest accepted their cup. Each guest thanked politely. Each guest hesitated, if only for a moment. Poirot noticed. He always noticed. He lifted his own cup, but he did not drink. Instead, he brought it slowly toward his face and inhaled. Lavender? Of course, but too pronounced, too concentrated. It was not the gentle scent of flowers carried by the breeze. It was something else, something added, something deliberate. Poirot's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. He tilted the cup, observing the liquid, perfectly normal in appearance, no visible disturbance, no obvious sign. And yet artificial, he thought. He placed the cup back down carefully without making a sound. His gaze moved across the table. One by one, he watched Lydia. Her fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Robert, still composed, still distant, Millicent, watching not the tea but the others. Mrs. Gray lifting her cup, slowly. Poirot leaned back slightly in his chair. Everything, he now understood, was aligned. The letter, the urgency, the tension, the excessive lavender, the unnatural calm. This was not a social gathering. This was a moment prepared in advance, a moment waiting to happen. And as Mrs. Gray raised her cup, Poirot's voice, though soft, carried a quiet certainty within his mind. Something, he thought, is about to occur. He did not move, he did not speak, he only watched. Because in that garden, surrounded by beauty, hidden beneath fragrance, death was already present. Chapter 3. The Murder. For a brief moment the garden held its breath. The soft hum of conversation faded as Mrs. Penelope Gray slowly rose from her chair. The delicate china cup remained in her hand, steady at first, as she looked around at her assembled guests. There was something in her expression, not warmth, not celebration, expectation. "I wish to make an announcement," she began. Her voice was clear, controlled, but only just. Hercule Poirot watched her closely. He had been waiting. It was subtle. So subtle that most would have missed it entirely. A tremor, barely visible. Her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the teacup. The porcelain rattled faintly against the saucer, a soft, almost delicate sound that disappeared into the stillness of the garden. But Poirot heard it, and more importantly, he understood it. Mrs. Gray's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, her composure broke. Confusion, then fear. Her hand jerked. The cup slipped. It struck the ground with a sharp, sudden crack, shattering into pale fragments that scattered across the stone, and in the very next instant, Mrs. Gray collapsed. For a moment no one moved. The world seemed to pause, suspended between what had been and what was about to be understood. Then, chaos. Chairs scraped harshly against the ground as the guests sprang to their feet. Voices overlapped in confusion, shock, disbelief. Mrs. Gray. What happened? Someone help her! Dr. Haydock moved first. He rushed forward with the quick, practiced urgency of a man accustomed to emergencies, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands were steady as he reached for her wrist, searching for a pulse. The garden fell silent again. All eyes fixed upon him. Seconds passed. Then he looked up, and in his expression there was no uncertainty. She is dead. The words settled heavily into the air. No one spoke. No one moved. The lavender-scented breeze continued to drift softly through the garden, as though unaware that something irreversible had just occurred. But Poirot did not rise, did not react, did not speak. Instead, he remained seated, his gaze calm, his posture unchanged, as though the event before him were not chaos, but evidence. Because to Poirot it was. His eyes moved slowly from one face to another, not missing a single detail. Miss Lydia Arkwright stood frozen, completely still, her eyes wide, fixed upon the body of Mrs. Gray. But it was not grief, it was not shock, it was recognition, as though what had just happened was not unexpected, only feared. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. Her hands trembled, but she did not move forward. Poirot noted it carefully. Not surprise, he thought. Anticipation. Robert Gray remained standing beside his chair, straight, controlled. His face revealed almost nothing. No visible grief. No outrage. No urgency. Only stillness. Too perfect. Too composed. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. A man may hide emotion, he thought, but he cannot erase it entirely. Millicent Gray was watching. Not her mother, not the body, the others. Her gaze moved quickly, almost instinctively from one face to another, observing reactions, measuring responses, calculating. And then just as quickly, she lowered her eyes, as though she had realized she was being observed. Poirot leaned back slightly in his chair. Everything had happened exactly as it should. Too exactly. The timing, the moment, the setting, a public gathering, a raised cup, an announcement interrupted. This was not chance. This was design. Slowly, without drawing attention, Poirot reached for his own teacup. Untouched, he lifted it slightly, examined the surface. Then very gently he placed it back onto the saucer, perfectly aligned, as though nothing had disturbed its place. Around him the confusion continued. Mrs. Harry whispered urgently to Dr. Haydock. A servant had appeared at the edge of the garden, uncertain whether to approach. The air, moments ago filled with polite conversation, now carried something else: fear, suspicion, uncertainty. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, not to rest, but to think. Lavender. too strong. A cup, or a tremor, a collapse, a death, too sudden to be natural. He opened his eyes again. Calm. Certain. Then, in a voice that was neither loud nor dramatic, but carried unmistakable authority, he spoke. "This," he said quietly, "is not an accident." The murmurs around him faded, heads turned, all eyes fixed upon him. Poirot rose slowly from his chair. He adjusted his coat, smoothed his sleeve, every movement deliberate, controlled, final, and then looking directly at the lifeless form of Mrs. Gray, he said, "This is murder." And in that moment, the tea party ended, and the investigation began. Chapter 4. The Poison. The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm. Sunlight fell gently across Lavender Lane, illuminating the same neat rows of purple blossoms, the same quiet path, the same stillness that had greeted the guests the previous day. To any passing observer, nothing had changed, but inside Greystone Cottage, everything had. The house now carried a different atmosphere. The silence was heavier, no longer peaceful, but watchful, as though the walls themselves had become aware of what had occurred within them. It was in this stillness that Inspector Graves arrived. He found Hercule Poirot standing near the window of the drawing-room, his hands folded neatly behind his back, his gaze directed outward toward the garden. "Mr. Poirot," Graves said, removing his hat, "We have the doctor's report." Poirot did not turn immediately. Instead, he spoke softly. "Yes. Poison." Graves paused, surprised. "You already know?" Poirot turned then, his expression calm. "I do not yet know, Inspector," he said gently. "I observe." Graves nodded, then continued. "Digitalis, extracted from foxglove, a strong dose, enough to stop the heart within minutes." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Ah, digitalis." He stepped slowly toward the table, considering the information carefully. "A most interesting choice," he added. "Not immediate like certain poisons, but certain, reliable." Graves frowned. "You mean it was planned?" Poirot allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Inspector, a poison such as this is never accidental." Poirot moved toward the door. "Come," he said quietly. "We must return to the garden." They stepped outside. The lavender greeted them again, rich, fragrant, almost suffocating in its presence. Poirot paused once more, breathing it in slowly. "Tell me, Inspector," he said, "what do you notice?" Graves looked around. "The garden, the flowers? It's well kept." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, not what you see." He leaned slightly forward. "What you smell." Graves hesitated. "Lavender." "Oui," Poirot said softly. "Lavender, but too much." He straightened. "Lavender is delicate, Inspector. It does not overwhelm unless it is made to do so." Graves's expression shifted slightly. "You think it was used to hide something?" Poirot nodded. "Yes." He turned his gaze toward the place where the tea had been served. "To hide the bitterness of digitalis." They walked further into the garden. It did not take long. There, among the decorative plants, stood a cluster of tall stems with bell-shaped flowers, pale, almost innocent in appearance. Foxglove. Graves stepped closer. "So this is it?" Poirot observed the plant quietly. "Nature provides the weapon," he said, "but it does not choose the victim." He reached out slightly, careful not to touch it. "Accessible," he added, "visible, known." Graves folded his arms. "So anyone here could have used it?" Poirot nodded. "Precisely." For a moment, neither spoke. The breeze moved softly through the garden, carrying the scent of lavender once more. Poirot turned away from the foxglove. "This tells us something important," he said. Graves looked at him. that the killer knew the house. More than that, Poirot replied. The killer knew the garden, the plants, the properties of what grew here.
He paused. And also how to conceal it.
Poirot returned to the table where the tea had been served the previous day. The cups had been cleared, but the arrangement remained. He stood where Mrs. Gray had stood. He looked down, then slowly, very slowly, he bent slightly, as though reconstructing the moment in his mind. The tea was prepared here, he said quietly. Graves nodded. Yes. Poirot lifted his hand slightly as though holding an invisible cup, and then served. He paused, his eyes narrowed. But the scent, Poirot inhaled again, deeply, carefully. Then he shook his head. No, he said softly. This is not natural. Graves frowned. What do you mean? Poirot straightened, turning toward him. The lavender in the garden is strong, he explained. Yes, but what we smelled yesterday was stronger still. He raised a finger slightly. Too consistent. Too concentrated. Graves's expression shifted. You think it was added? Poirot nodded. Not simply brewed tea? He paused. Enhanced. Graves looked thoughtful now. So the poison was mixed into the tea, and the lavender was used to disguise it. Poirot gave a small nod. Yes, but not carelessly. He began to walk slowly along the edge of the garden. The scent had to be balanced, not so strong as to raise suspicion, but strong enough to mask the bitterness. He stopped. But this was not the work of chance. Poirot turned back toward the cottage. The poison came from here, he said, quietly. Graves followed his gaze. From the house? Poirot nodded. From within. He looked once more at the lavender, at the garden, at the place where everything had appeared so calm, so orderly, so harmless. Then he spoke, almost to himself. The killer did not bring death with them. A brief pause. They prepared it here. And as the morning light settled across the garden, the beauty of Lavender Lane seemed, for the first time, deceptive. Chapter 5. The Burnt Will. The garden of Greystone Cottage appeared unchanged. The same soft breeze moved gently through the rows of lavender. The same sunlight fell across the neatly arranged path. To anyone passing by, it would seem as though the previous day's tragedy had left no mark at all. But Hercule Poirot knew better. Crime, he often said, never vanished. It lingered, in places, in objects, in the smallest details others failed to notice. Poirot stepped slowly across the garden, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, as though he were not searching, but remembering. Inspector Graves followed at a distance, watching him with growing curiosity. You think there is something here? The inspector asked. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped. His gaze lowered slightly. Now then, he moved toward a quieter corner of the garden, near the edge of the lavender rows where the ground showed faint disturbance. There, something out of place. Poirot bent down carefully. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a small piece of charred paper, fragile, partially buried beneath the soil and ash. But Poirot's eyes sharpened instantly. He reached into his pocket and produced a pair of gloves, slipping them on with precise care before lifting the fragment gently from the ground. Inspector Graves stepped closer. What is it? Poirot turned the object slightly in the light. A message, he said softly. Or rather, what remains of one. It was a half-burnt envelope. The edges were blackened, curled inward from the heat. The paper itself had been destroyed in places, but not entirely. Enough remained. Enough to speak. Poirot carefully opened what was left of the envelope. Inside there was a fragment of a document. He held it delicately, ensuring it did not crumble. Graves leaned forward, reading over his shoulder. "The last will and testament." The words were incomplete, the rest gone, consumed by fire. Poirot's expression did not change, but his mind moved swiftly. He straightened slowly. "Someone," he said quietly, "wished to destroy inheritance." Graves frowned. "You're certain this is a will?" Poirot gave a slight nod. "Certain enough, Inspector." He turned the fragment slightly again, examining the edges. The intention was clear. It was not discarded. A pause. It was destroyed. Poirot began to walk again, slowly, thoughtfully, the burnt fragment held securely in his gloved hand. "Now," he said, "we begin to understand." Graves followed. "Understand what?" Poirot stopped. He turned slightly, his gaze sharp. "The motive." He raised a finger. "One must always ask, who benefits?" Then one by one he spoke the names. "Robert Gray?" Graves nodded. "The son?" Poirot continued. "A man of control, of restraint." He paused briefly. "He would inherit naturally." Another pause. "But perhaps not entirely." "Miss Millicent Gray." Graves glanced toward the house. She seemed nervous. Poirot nodded. "Yes, controlled, but not at peace." He folded his hands lightly. "A daughter who may feel overlooked, forgotten, less valued." A quiet breath. "Resentment, Inspector, is often the beginning of intention." "And then," Poirot's tone shifted slightly, "Miss Lydia Arkwright." Graves frowned. "The niece." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Is she?" Silence. Poirot continued softly. "A stranger introduced as family, nervous, watchful." He turned slightly toward the house. "A person without a clear place, but with sudden proximity." Graves crossed his arms. "So all three have motive." Poirot shook his head gently. "No." He held up the burnt fragment. "They have possibility." A brief pause. "Motive is something deeper." Poirot looked again at the fragment, then at the garden, then at the house, everything connected. And yet, something did not. He spoke quietly. "This is not yet complete." Graves looked at him. "What's missing?" Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he walked back toward the lavender. The scent still lingered, strong, persistent. Poirot closed his eyes briefly. A will, destroyed. A poison, prepared. A gathering, timed perfectly. "No," he said softly. "This is not the work of a simple mind." He opened his eyes again. "There is structure here." Poirot turned to Graves. "You see the will, Inspector?" Graves nodded. "Yes, but ask yourself." Poirot's voice lowered slightly. "Why burn it?" Graves hesitated. "To hide inheritance." Poirot tilted his head. "Yes." A pause. "But also to change it." Graves's expression shifted. "You think the will was altered?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "I think, Inspector, that someone wished the truth to disappear." He looked once more at the burnt fragment, at the fragile remains of what had once been certainty. Then he said quietly, "And when truth is destroyed?" A brief pause. "It is because it threatens someone." The breeze moved again through the lavender. Soft, fragrant, deceptive, and for the first time, the garden did not feel like a place of beauty, but a place where something had been hidden, carefully, deliberately, and not yet fully revealed. Chapter 6. Lydia's Secret. The afternoon light filtered softly through the curtains of the small sitting room where Miss Lydia Arkwright had agreed, reluctantly, to speak. The house, though modest, carried a certain unease. It was not in the furniture, nor in the walls, but in the air itself. A tension that had settled quietly, like something waiting to be revealed. Hercule Poirot stood near the window, his posture calm, composed, as though the conversation ahead required no effort at all. But in truth, it required precision. He turned slowly. Lydia sat opposite him. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, too tightly, her fingers pressed into one another as though she were holding herself together by force alone. She did not look at him, not yet. Poirot spoke gently.
You are her niece. The question was simple, carefully simple.
Lydia nodded quickly. Yes. Her voice was soft. Too soft. Poirot did not react. Instead, he took a few steps forward and seated himself opposite her, ensuring that the distance between them was neither too close nor too far. Perfect. Balanced. And yet, he continued calmly, no one speaks of you. Silence. It stretched between them, thin but unbreakable. Lydia's hands tightened further. Her gaze dropped. Her breathing shifted, just slightly, but enough. Poirot leaned forward just a fraction, not enough to intimidate, just enough to focus. You were present yesterday, he said softly. You saw what happened. She nodded again. Yes, but... He paused, carefully, deliberately. You were afraid. A slight movement. Her shoulders stiffened. Poirot's voice remained calm. Not surprised. A longer pause. Afraid. That was enough. Lydia's composure shattered, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like glass under pressure. I didn't mean to kill her. The words came suddenly, uncontrollably, as though they had been waiting for release. She looked up, her eyes wide, filled with panic. I didn't know it would... Her voice broke. Poirot did not move, did not react, did not accuse. Instead, he nodded, slowly, calmly. Of course not. Lydia froze, her breath caught. She stared at him. You believe me? Poirot's expression did not change. I do not deal in belief, he said gently. I deal in understanding. He leaned back slightly, relaxing the tension.
Allowing her to breathe. You are not the murderer, he continued. The words landed softly, but with certainty. Lydia's shoulders dropped slightly as though a weight she had been carrying had shifted, but not disappeared. Then, what am I? She whispered. Poirot's eyes softened, only slightly. You are, he said quietly, a piece. Lydia's hands trembled. I didn't want this, she said. I didn't want any of it. Poirot waited. Silence was often more powerful than questions. It started with letters, she continued. Her voice steadied slightly, though fear still lingered beneath it. They came, one after another. Always the same handwriting, always careful, always controlled. Poirot nodded faintly. Continue. They knew things, Lydia said, about Mrs. Gray, about the house, about everything. Her fingers tightened again.
Oh, they told me I had a right. A right? Poirot repeated softly. To inheritance, she said. The word hung heavily between them. They said I was connected, that I had been overlooked, forgotten, she swallowed. That the will was wrong. Poirot's gaze sharpened slightly. And what were you asked to do? Lydia hesitated. Then, talk to her. Mrs. Gray? She nodded. Yes, to get close to her, to influence her. Her voice dropped further. To make her change the will. Poirot's fingers came together lightly. Ah. And the letters? He asked. They guided me, Lydia said. What to say, when to say it, what to do. Her eyes filled again. I thought it was just persuasion. Poirot said nothing. I didn't know, she whispered. You did not know about the poison, Poirot said calmly. She shook her head quickly. No, I swear. I know. Poirot leaned forward again, just slightly. Now, precision mattered. The person who wrote to you, he said quietly. The one who guided you. A pause. What is the name? Lydia hesitated, her brow furrowed. I never saw it, she said slowly. Not properly. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on hers. Think carefully. She closed her eyes briefly. Searching, remembering. There was always just one thing, she said at last. Poirot did not move. Initials. He spoke softly. What initials? Lydia opened her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. G. The room fell silent. Completely. Poirot leaned back slowly in his chair. His hands came together, his expression calm. But his mind, now moving faster than ever. G. He repeated softly. A letter, a fragment, a beginning, and perhaps the key to everything. Poirot rose slowly, adjusted his coat. Then almost to himself he said, Now. A shadow begins to take shape. And for the first time, the unseen presence behind the crime felt closer. Chapter 7. The Hidden Hand. The pieces, at last, had begun to align. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough for Hercule Poirot to see the outline of something far more deliberate than it had first appeared. He stood once more in the drawing-room of Greystone Cottage, his posture composed, his hands lightly clasped behind his back. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, quiet shadows across the polished floor. Inspector Graves stood nearby, watching him with growing impatience. "Well?" the inspector asked. "You've been quiet all morning. What have you found?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved slowly across the room, his gaze drifting from object to object, as though each one carried a memory he alone could read. Then he stopped and spoke. "Everything," Poirot said softly, "is connected." Graves folded his arms. "In what way?" Poirot turned slightly, his eyes calm but precise. "The letters," he began. A pause. The burnt will. Another pause. The manipulation of the girl. He let the words settle. And the poison. Graves frowned. That could still be several people. Poirot shook his head, gently. "No, Inspector." He stepped forward. "This is not chaos." A slight pause. "This is design." Poirot's voice lowered slightly, becoming more deliberate. "To create such a crime, one must possess three things." He raised a finger. "History." Another finger. "Knowledge." And finally, "motive." Graves watched him carefully now. "You think all three belong to one person?" Poirot inclined his head. "Yes." Poirot turned toward the window, his gaze shifting beyond the present, into memory, into what had been hidden. "The past, Inspector," he said quietly, "is never truly gone. It waits." He paused. "And sometimes it returns." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook. Within it, carefully written, a name. Greta Langford. Graves's expression changed. "That name." "Yes," Poirot said softly. "You have heard it." Poirot began to walk again, slowly, as though reconstructing the story step by step. "Years ago," he said, "there was a connection between Mrs. Gray and a woman named Greta Langford." He paused. "A close connection." Graves nodded slightly. "I recall something. There was talk, but nothing confirmed." Poirot's lips curved faintly. "Of course, such matters are rarely confirmed," he continued. "She was part of the household, trusted, accepted." A pause. "Until she was not." Graves leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" Poirot stopped. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter. Humiliation. The word lingered. She was removed, Poirot continued. Cast out, dismissed not only from the house, but from respect. He looked directly at Graves. And for some, that is not forgotten. She disappeared. Poirot went on. No contact? No return? No explanation? A brief pause, as though she had ceased to exist. Graves nodded slowly. And now you think she's back? Poirot's gaze sharpened. I do not think, Inspector. A slight pause. I know? Poirot turned, his voice now calm but certain. She returned, not as herself. He raised his hand slightly. But as someone else. Graves's eyes narrowed. Who? Poirot held his gaze for a moment, then spoke clearly. Miss Fenwick? The name settled heavily into the room. Graves straightened. Fenwick? The woman staying at the boarding house? Poirot nodded. Yes. He stepped closer. Consider it, Inspector. He began again, methodically. The letters, written with care, with knowledge of the household. The will, targeted, altered, then destroyed. The girl, selected, manipulated, controlled. The poison, prepared using local plants hidden beneath scent. He paused. All of this requires familiarity. Graves' expression darkened. She knew the house. Intimately, Poirot replied. Poirot's tone softened slightly. And Lydia... He shook his head faintly. A pawn? Graves exhaled slowly. She never intended to kill. No, Poirot agreed. She intended to belong. A brief silence followed. She was chosen, Poirot continued, because she was vulnerable, because she could be shaped. He looked toward the door as though seeing beyond it. Given hope, then guided. Poirot turned back. And who guides such a plan? A pause, not a fool. He spoke the words clearly now. She used Lydia as a tool. She encouraged the change of the will. And when the moment came, a slight pause. She prepared the poison. Graves stood still, the pieces now visible, the pattern undeniable. This wasn't sudden, he said quietly. Poirot nodded. No. This was patience. A faint smile touched Poirot's lips. Revenge, he said softly, is rarely hurried. The room fell silent once more, but this time it was not uncertainty, it was clarity. Poirot adjusted his cuffs lightly. Everything now had form, shape, meaning. Only one step remained. And as he turned toward the door, he said quietly, Now, Inspector. A slight pause. We shall allow the truth to speak for itself. And somewhere within Greystone Cottage, the past, long buried, was ready to be exposed. Chapter 8. The Final Reveal. The drawing room of Greystone Cottage had been prepared once again, but this time it was not for tea, it was for truth. All were gathered. The chairs had been arranged in a careful semicircle, facing the center of the room where a small table stood, empty except for a single untouched teacup. The air was still, heavy with expectation, as though even the walls understood that something final was about to occur. Inspector Graves stood near the fireplace, his posture firm, watchful. Dr. Haydock sat quietly, his expression serious. Mrs. Harry leaned forward slightly, unable to hide her curiosity. Robert Gray stood with arms folded, composed, but not entirely at ease. Millicent sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze lowered. And Lydia. She remained near the edge of the room, pale, silent, as though she had already lived through the truth that was yet to be spoken. At last, Hercule Poirot stepped forward. He stood calmly in the center of the room, perfectly still, perfectly composed. His eyes moved slowly across each face, not hurried, not uncertain, but precise, as though placing each person exactly where they belonged. Then he spoke. "This case," he said quietly, "is simple when one removes the illusion." A silence followed. No one interrupted. No one dared. Poirot raised his hand slightly. "First, Miss Lydia Arkwright." All eyes turned toward her. Lydia stiffened. Poirot's voice remained gentle. "You believed you had been given an opportunity." A pause. "A place, a future, a right." Lydia's lips trembled. "But in truth," Poirot continued, "you were chosen." Another pause. "Chosen to be used." A faint murmur moved through the room. Poirot did not react. "You were guided," he said, "through letters, through suggestion, through promises." He looked at her kindly. "You did not kill Mrs. Gray." A soft breath escaped her. "You were manipulated." Poirot turned. "Robert Gray!" Robert met his gaze without flinching. "You had motive," Poirot said calmly. "Inheritance, position, control." A slight pause. "And yet," Poirot stepped closer, "you did nothing." Robert's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Poirot nodded faintly. "A man may lack warmth, but still possess restraint." Poirot shifted his attention. "Miss Millicent Gray." She lifted her eyes slowly. "You were afraid," Poirot said. A pause. "Not of your mother?" Another pause. "But of what might happen?" Her hands tightened further. "You saw something," Poirot added quietly. "Something you did not understand, but felt." She lowered her gaze again. Poirot turned. The room grew still. "And now," his voice lowered slightly, "the illusion ends." He took a single step forward. Then he turned and faced her. Madame A. pause, Greta Langford. Silence, absolute. The woman standing near the far wall, known to all as Miss Fenwick, did not move at first. Then her composure cracked, her hand trembled, her breath caught, and for the first time she looked afraid. "You returned," Poirot continued calmly, "under another name. No denial. You entered this house not as a guest." A slight pause. "But as a memory." Her lips parted, but no words came. "You knew the garden," Poirot said, "the plants, the house, the habits." He stepped closer. "You wrote the letters." A pause. "You guided the girl." Another step. "You encouraged the change of the will." The room seemed to shrink around them. "And when the moment came," Poirot's voice remained steady, "you poisoned the tea." She broke. "It was hers!" she cried suddenly. The words exploded from her, sharp, raw, uncontrollable. "She ruined my life." Her voice trembled with something deeper than anger. "She took everything from me, my place, my dignity, my future." No one moved, no one spoke. Poirot stood still, listening. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes." The single word landed softly, but with weight. "She wronged you," he continued quietly. A pause. "She humiliated you." Her breathing slowed, but her eyes burned. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And so," a final pause, "you took hers." The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was final. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Greta Langford," he said firmly, "you are under arrest for the murder of Mrs. Penelope Gray." She did not resist. As the inspector took her arm, she looked once more around the room, not at the people, but at the house. Then she was gone. The room remained still. No one spoke. No one moved. Poirot adjusted his cuffs lightly. Everything was now in its place. Order restored. He glanced once toward the empty teacup on the table, then said quietly, "Justice," a slight pause, "is merely the restoration of balance." And with that, the case of the lavender tea was complete.
If you enjoy our story, then please like and subscribe.